Hello, welcome. This is David Golinkin, live from Jerusalem from the Schechter Institute. It's nice to see many of you, and some of you I cannot see on screen. You're off on the other screen. And we realize it's a very busy time of year in terms of general holidays and Jewish holidays. Here in Jerusalem tonight is Yom Yerushalayim, the 54th anniversary of the reunification of Jerusalem. And of course, in the States and maybe Canada, it's Mother's Day. And quite a few people wrote to me and told me that they could not attend today because of Mother's Day, but they will watch the recording. So I hope the recordings come through. I would like to thank our technical staff, Michal Makov Pele, Director of Development at Schechter, and Yoshua Levi.
Right,
Yoshua, you can wave. And it's good to see all of you from near and far. Our lineup this evening is I will be talking about some of the Shavuot customs that I did not talk about last year. 3 to be specific: the Tikkun itself, the custom of decorating houses and synagogues with grass, trees, and flowers, and a little bit about the Ketubah and the Tnaim for Shavuot, in which God marries the Jewish people or the Torah marries the Jewish people, depending on your version. We will then continue with Dr. Cohen Sentner, the music of Shavuot from the famous to the obscure, Rabbi Benjamin Siegel on conversion, intermarriage, and the Book of Ruth, and Rabbi Irena Gritsevskaya on the mystery of Shavuot according to S.Y. Agnon. So without further ado, I'm going to enter into my topic. So this is a brief version or highlights from my responsum. Why do many Jews stay up all night studying Torah and Shavuot? Michal, can you see the text? Yoshua? Yeah. In printed form, it appeared in my book, Responds in a Moment, Volume 3, and it's also on the Schechter Institute website. And I'd like to study with you a few of the main sources about the custom of the Tikkun, which, of course, today is a very popular custom coming up next Sunday night, but that was not always the case. And as we'll see, the Tikkun, even though it's hinted at in the Zohar, really only started to exist in the 16th century. There are a number of passages in the Zohar related to staying up all night for the Tikkun. I'm going to highlight source number 4. All modern scholars think that the Zohar, even though it's attributed to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, was actually written by Moshe de Leon in Spain in the 13th century. And in his Hebrew work, which is called Sod Chag HaShavuot, the mystery of the holiday of Shavuot, which is found in the manuscript at the Schechter Institute in Jerusalem, he explains there, I think, in a clearer fashion than what he says in the Zohar. The early sages of blessed memory were accustomed, the pillars of the world, who knew how to draw grace from the heavens, not to sleep on these 2 nights of Shavuot. Notice that he's saying you should have a tikkun 2 nights in a row, which is a bit much. And all night they read from the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. And from there they skip around in the Talmud and legends, and they read in the wisdom and the secrets of the Torah until the light of day. In other words, both the written Torah, the oral Torah, the Talmud, as well as the secrets, which is obviously the Zoharic literature. And the night is the night for God to connect the written Torah and the oral Torah, and her special children on earth bring her into the chuppah. They are the bridesmen of the bride. And according to the Zohar and this Hebrew work by Moshe de Leon, the Tikkun custom was really intended for a small group of Kabbalists. And it really only came into its own as a more widespread custom beginning in the 16th century. And now we'll skip to source number 6. Rabbi Yitzchak ben Shlomo HaEzovi. Let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger. Too big. Rabbi Yitzchak ben Shlomo HaEzovi wrote in his Agudat HaEzov around the year 1500, one must engage in the oral Torah all of Shavuot Eve, and in the daytime will come the acceptance of the written Torah, and then he is crowned with both. And so was the custom of the early pious ones, that they did not sleep the entire night, or another version as nights, meaning they did it for 2 nights, for they were engaged in Torah, and they would say, we will come and we will inherit a holy inheritance for us and for our children in 2 worlds, meaning this world and the next world. But again, this was not yet a mass custom. And the ones who turned it into a mass custom were two good friends, Rabbi Shlomo Alkabetz, the author of Lecha Dodi. If you look at any Siddur in the world and you look carefully at the acrostic, you will see his name, Shlomo Alkabetz, in the verses of Lecha Dodi, and his good friend, Rabbi Yosef Karo. And ironically, they did not invent this custom in Safed, in Tzfat, after making Aliyah. They invented this custom when they were still in Turkey. And this took place in Adrianople, somewhere around 1530 or 1534. They stayed up studying all night. After studying selected passages from the Torah, the 2 Haftarot of Shavuot, 3 chapters of Psalms, the Song of Songs, Ruth, and the end of Chronicles, they then studied 2 tractates of the Mishnah. And then Rabbi Yosef Karo had one of his mystical experiences. Rabbi Yosef Karo, in addition to being a very important halachic scholar who wrote the Shulchan Aruch and the Beit Yosef, was also a mystic. And he would have these mystic trances in which the Mishnah would talk out of his mouth. And he collected these mystical experiences in a book that I have here on my shelf. I'm looking at it. It's a big fat book that's called Magid Mesharim. And this was one of his mystical experiences after studying the various passages from the Tanakh and the Mishnah with his friend Rabbi Shlomo Alkabetz. They heard the voice of the Shekhinah coming out of the mouth of Rabbi Yosef Karo, and Rabbi Alkabetz took notes. He obviously didn't take the notes on Shavuot, but the notes are preserved in 2 different places as to what the Shekhinah said through Rabbi Yosef Karo's mouth. And the voice of the Shekhinah praised the scholars who were crowning the Shekhinah on this night. And if you were 10, I would ascend even higher, so says the Mishnah. They then continued studying, and then the Shekhinah spoke again and told them to continue studying and to make Aliyah, for not all times are equal, for I will give you sustenance in Eretz Yisrael. So here we have perhaps one of the first Aliyah speeches in history, not from a Shaliach of the Jewish Agency or Nefesh B'Nefesh, but rather coming from the Shekhinah, from God himself, telling these 2 scholars that not only should they continue studying, but they should also make Aliyah to Israel, which is exactly what they did. And they made Aliyah to Tzfat, to Safed, Rabbi Yosef Karo in 1536, Rabbi Shlomo Alkabetz in 1535. And as they say, the rest is history. And ironically, even though Rabbi Yosef Karo did not codify this custom in the Shulchan Aruch, which is ironic, here's the guy who invented the custom, but he does not include it in his code of Jewish law. Nonetheless, it spread like wildfire among the various mystics of the Kabbalists of Tzfat. And I'm going to skip now to 1620, which is source number 11. Source number 12, Rabbi Chaim Vital, the Talmid Muvhak, the devoted pupil of the Ari of Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, died in 1620. And he wrote in his Shara Kavanot, which I'm also looking at across here in my office, a very large folio-sized book. He says in his Shara Kavanot that the custom has already spread in Israel to engage in Torah study the entire night of Shavuot. He further states that whoever does not sleep even one moment and will study Torah, it is promised to him that he will live that year and no evil will befall him that year. And then he lays out the text that should be studied, an order still practiced by many Jews until today. And I'll show you the book in a minute, which contains these passages. The first 3 and the last 3 verses of every Torah portion, the sections of the Torah and the prophets which have some connection to Shavuot, such as the 10 Commandments, the Omer, the passage in the Torah describing the Omer, the Haftarot of Shavuot, and the book of Ruth. And the rest of the night is devoted to the secrets of the Torah and the Zohar, according to what your mind can grasp. So writes Rabbi Chaim Vital in the early 17th century. And similarly, just a few short years later, in the 1620s, we have the description of Rabbi Isaiah Harvitz, who's known also as the Shlah or Ashlah HaKadosh for his book Shnei Luchot HaBrit. He makes Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael in the 1620s from Germany. And he says He testifies that the custom is spread on all of Eretz Yisrael and the entire kingdom. No one is left out, all from the great to the small, and they accept it upon them and their descendants. And he encourages this custom of staying up all night. On this night of Shavuot, sleep should be denied from anyone who wants to cling to holiness, and let him engage in Torah all night. His order of study is slightly different than Chaim Vital. The first and last 3 verses of every weekly Torah portion, the first and last 3 verses of every book in the Bible, the first and last Mishnah of every tractate in the Mishnah, the first and last Mishnah of Sefer Yetzirah, which is an important mystical text, the Zohar, Emor, a certain patches of the Zohar, the 613 commandments, and the Song of Songs. And according to Rabbi Isaiah Horowitz, the study is divided into 13 parts, and Kaddish is recited after each part. How did this really take off in the end? Professor Jacob Pedachowski once wrote that the ultimate authority in matters liturgical is the printer, which means that once something is printed, and if it's reprinted many times, it has a life of its own. And that is what happened with the Tikkun Leil Shavuot. It was first printed in Krakow 1612 at the end of a book called Tikkunei Shabbat. But in Venice in 1648, it was printed together with the Tikkun for the night of Hoshana Rabbah. And notice the statistic here. Between 1648 and 1839, the Tikkun booklet had been printed 88 times. Right? That's what they call today in Hebrew a bestseller, Rav Mecher, right? 88 times over the course of less than 200 years, primarily in Amsterdam and Venice. And I have here 2 examples. I have here an old decrepit example of the Tikkun Leil Shavuot, printed in Germany in 1903. The paper is literally falling apart, right? You can see what it says here. It says here, Seder Halimud Leil Shavuot, and it includes, I'll do that for the easy one that I can turn the pages without it falling apart. This is a cheap paperback reprint, but the original of this reprint was printed in Warsaw in 1873. And it has here the beginning and the end of every Torah portion. It has here the beginning and end of every book of the Nevi'im, of the prophets. It has here the beginning and the end of the books of Ketuvim, of the writings. Then it goes on to the Mishnah, the beginning and the end of every tractate of the Mishnah, 63 tractates. This is followed by Sefer Yetzirah, that Kabbalistic work we mentioned before. And last but not least, the Taryag Mitzvot, the 613 commandments. Now you may say, well, this is incredibly boring to sit and read these passages from these books. Many of the people who read it had little understanding of what they were reading. They were not necessarily Talmidei Chachamim. And nonetheless, this became a standard practice among thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Jews, every year reciting the Tikkun Leil Shavuot all night long. And believe it or not, still today, there are Jews, this is what they do at the Tikkun. They read through the book of Tikkun Leil Shavuot as set out by Rabbi Isaiah Horowitz and others. They don't study new material. They don't listen to interesting lectures. They simply go through the entire booklet of Tikkun Leil Shavuot and symbolically complete the entire Torah on the night of Shavuot. And needless to say, I think that listening to lectures on the night of Shavuot is much more interesting. Of course, we're doing our mini Tikkun now, and that has, of course, been the modern custom for the past number of decades. But the original custom was to recite these various passages from the Tanakh, from the Mishnah, from the Zohar, etc., etc. And that was the Tikkun Leil Shavuot that existed for hundreds of years until modern Jews began to do all of the tikkunim that we attend today, where various rabbis and scholars give lectures on various aspects of Judaism. So that is the first custom I wanted to share with you. Do you have any questions or comments? If you have, perhaps we can take one question or comment before we move on to the next custom. I'll stop share. Any questions or comments about the Tikkun custom itself? It's all crystal clear.
Very, very interesting, I have to say.
Toda, Michal. Okay, so now we'll move on to another custom which is much less well known, at least where I grew up in the States. It's quite common in Israel, and that is the custom of decorating your house and your synagogue with branches and grass and flowers for the holiday of Shavuot. And I'm going to pull up the sources. Let me just see if I can move this black bar. There we go. Okay, can you all see the picture on screen? A picture is worth 1,000 words. And this is a black and white. Originally, it was, I believe, a copper engraving. It says Shavuot scenes, service in the synagogue, decorated with trees and flowers, from Johann Bodenschatz, Kirchliche Verfassung der heutigen Juden, from 1748. This is a famous book by a non-Jew describing in an anthropological fashion the customs of the Jews in Germany in 1748. As you can see, this picture of Shavuot is filled with rather large trees decorating the synagogue. You can also see 4 trees around the bima. Maybe I can make it a little bit bigger. 4 trees around the bima. You can see people here holding Sidurim or other books. And in the forefront, you have 2 very large trees. Perhaps the most famous illustration of this custom is this one, which you can easily find on Wikipedia Commons. But I prefer to find it in this book, which I can barely lift, which is the drawings of Moritz Daniel Oppenheim. And Oppenheim was a famous Jewish artist in the 19th century. I think there was no German Jewish home that did not have paintings or reproductions by Moritz Oppenheim. And this is his illustration of Shavuot from 1880. And you can see the Chazan standing in front of the ark. He's holding a Sefer Torah. There's a younger boy holding another Sefer Torah for the 2 Torahs read. There's a wreath of flowers and leaves in front of the ark. There are a number of large trees on either side of the ark. In other words, they actually brought trees into the synagogue for the holiday of Shavuot. And the third Gilgul, the third reworking of this custom, was a custom that was very common in Eastern Europe. I'm going to turn this up right side up. This is taken from Philip Goodman's Shavuot anthology. And these are paper cuts, not paper cuts that you cut your finger with paper, but paper cuts that people did with great skill. You can see here 2 fish flanking a synagogue, 2 large birds or eagles flanking a synagogue, 2 deer on either side of a menorah, and here it says Yom Chag HaShavuot Hazeh, with all sorts of flowers. And in Yiddish, these decorations were called Shavuoslach or Reizelach. Shavuoslach for the holiday of Shavuot, Reizelach type of flower. And this was a very common practice in Eastern Europe. And my colleague Gila Katz, who was director of our Midrashet Yerushalayim program in Ukraine for many, many years, she's still working for us part-time, but she recently retired. She told me that when she was a young girl in the Ukraine in the 1940s, her mother still made Shavuoslach for the holiday of Shavuot. She was in Chernovitz, which is where we have one of our Midrashet Yerushalayim programs. And because of the Soviet regime, she didn't put them in the windows facing the street because she was afraid of the Russian authorities. She put them in the windows facing the courtyard. But she continued the custom of Shavuoslach until our generation. I am sure there are still Jews who observe this custom. The question, of course, is where do these customs come from? Why do we decorate the synagogue and our homes with these Shavuoslach or Rezalach, or with the actual branches, trees, and flowers. And as usual, and by the way, this too appeared in one of my books, Response in a Moment, Volume 4.
צריך to unmute. הכל נעלם.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. So this responsum was called, Why do we decorate synagogues and homes with trees and flowers in honor of Shavuot? And as is the case with many, many Ashkenazic customs, this custom began with Rabbi Yaakov Molin, who most people know as the Maharil, who died in Ashkenaz in Austria in 1427. He says, I'll make this a little larger, it is customary to spread on the floor of the synagogue spices of grasses, i.e. sweet-smelling grasses, and shoshanim, lilies, to rejoice in the Pilgrim Festival. And when Shavuot falls on Sunday, meaning that it starts on Saturday night, the Maharil instituted to spread the grasses on Friday. In other words, he didn't want people doing this, spreading the grasses on Shabbat, which is obviously forbidden. So he said that you should spread the grasses on Friday, but this means that he thought it was an obligatory custom. This made it into the Shulchan Aruch through Rabbi Moshe Isserles, who died in 1572. He says briefly in the laws of Shavuot, and it is customary to spread grasses on Shavuot in the synagogue and the houses in memory of the joy of the giving of the Torah. What this has to do with the giving of the Torah is not at all clear. The custom is repeated by Rabbi Yosef Yusbahan, who died in 1637, Frankfurt on Main. And he goes, but our custom is to cover in this fashion the floor of all the houses. In other words, not only in the synagogues, but in the houses as well. We should put the branches and the flowers. Another famous source about this custom is Rabbi Yusba Shamash, died in Worms in 1678. You'll notice these are all Ashkenazic authorities. By the way, later on in the printed version of this responsum in the book, I discovered an Italian rabbi who also reports on the custom in the 17th century. But this is a famous Ashkenazic source, Rabbi Yusba Shamash, 17th century. They cover the floor of the synagogues and the houses with grasses before Mincha, and they put on top of and the sides of the Holy Ark and on the tower, which is the Torah reading tower, lilies and flowers and grasses which smell good. And for every chaver in the Ashkenazic synagogue, they had a ranking of the rabbis. It wasn't like today where everybody's just harav, rabbi. There's a chaver, there's morenu, there's the abedin, there's a hierarchy of rabbis. For every chaver and for every parnas, one lily on his seat. To morenu, 2 lilies, and to the abedin, many lilies, as many as the shamas wants. And this is the shamas writing this paragraph. He's telling you what he does every year for Shavuot. And if Shavuot falls on Sunday, they cover the floors and they put the lilies on the Friday before. And so on down through Ashkenazic Jewish history, we see that this custom is repeatedly mentioned. Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who died in 1776, and they use many aromatic flowers for the joy of this Yom Tov. Rabbi Shneir Zalman of Liadi, the founder of Chabad Hasidim, also mentions the custom. And here we finally see a migration to Islamic lands, beginning at the end of the 19th century. Rabbi Chaim Falache or Falaji, a famous posek in Izmir in Turkey, Rabbi Edu Chazan in Alexandria in Egypt in the late 19th century, and Rabbi Shem Tov Gagin, who was the Chacham of London in the middle of the 20th century. He talks about the custom in Eretz Yisrael, Syria, Turkey, and Egypt to hang from the Torah Rimonim some flowers and Shoshanim. And we already mentioned the illustrations. And of course, the question is why? I will tell you quite frankly that until I found the real reason, I did not find any of these explanations convincing. They are wonderful drashot. Jews are great at making up drashot. For example, There were grasses around Mount Sinai, as it is written, neither the flocks and the cattle graze opposite that mountain. In other words, there were grasses because it says in the Torah that the flocks and the cattle were not allowed to graze. So the grasses grew. So in memory of those grasses, they grew for a total of 3 days, right? For in memory of those grasses, we spread grasses on the floor of the synagogue. Another explanation by the Magen Avraham in the 17th century, it is customary to set up trees in the synagogue and in the homes. And it seems to me that the reason is that they should remind us that on Shavuot, we are judged for the fruit of the trees, right? We are judged al ha'ilan, Rosh Hashanah la'ilan, according to the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah. And therefore, we're reminded that we're being judged on the fruit, and we put trees and branches in the synagogue and so on. I do not find any of the other 6 explanations any more convincing. What is the original reason? Rabbi Avram Danzig makes a brief statement about this. He was a student of the Gaon of Vilna. He says the Gaon of Vilna abolished the custom of setting up trees on Shavuot because it is chok ha'amim, meaning the law of the nations of the Christians, to set up trees on their holiday. And he's not talking about Christmas because it's the wrong time of year. So what was the Gaon? And later on, I found the quote in the Gaon of Vilna. What was the Gaon of Vilna talking about? Professor Theodor Gaster explains in 1953, in many parts of Europe, it is customary to deck the churches at Whitsun, which is Pentecost, the 7th Sunday after Easter, with wreaths and bunches of flowers. In Catholic districts of Germany, even private dwellings are adorned with green twigs on this occasion. In Italy, rose leaves are scattered from the ceilings of churches during the progress of the services. Similarly, in Russia, it is customary to carry flowers and green twigs on Whitsun. All this appears to be but a Christian transformation of the ancient Roman festival of Rosalia or Rosalia, celebrated in the preceding month, etc., etc. In other words, Gaster, as is his standard custom, says that the Christians got it from the Romans and we got it from the Christians. In this particular case, I think he is correct. There is no Jewish source for trees and flowers in the synagogue on Shavuot. There are many, many Christian sources for trees and flowers on Pentecost. Of course, one could then object that if we borrowed these Shavuot customs from our Christian neighbors, doesn't this invalidate them? I would reply that, first of all, many important poskim have justified this specific custom despite the objections of the Gaon of Vilna. But more generally, I've shown elsewhere that many Jewish laws and customs began as pagan or Christian or Muslim customs, and they were Judaized by rabbis or by the Jewish people. The most famous example is the Pesach Seder, where the rabbis took the Hellenistic symposium and transformed it into the central ritual of Pesach. So I believe that what the Jews did in Germany, as they've been doing for thousands of years, is they took the non-Jewish custom and they Judaized it. It became a beautiful Jewish custom for the holiday of Shavuot, and they made up the 8 drashot, the 8 sermonic explanations, which I quote in my responsum, and therefore I think it's a beautiful custom to decorate our synagogues and even our homes with branches and trees and flowers on the holiday of Shavuot, as we saw in the beautiful illustration by Moritz Oppenheim in the year 1880. My time is up, so I'm going to pull myself off the stage with a cane. If you have one question or comment, we can take it. Yes, Rosa Berman. Right, you're on mute.
Well, okay, thank you. My question is this: Shavuot is one of the 3 Shalosh Regalim, and so where the Israelites were supposed to come to the temple, Shavuot is only observed here in the States. It's 2 days, right? But I don't know if in Israel it's 1 day. The other 2 Regalim are 8 days. So did it make sense for people to travel from distant places to the temple in Jerusalem for 1 day? How does that get explained?
Well, interestingly enough, we know that they did. We have a tractate of the Mishnah called Bikurim, which is one of the things I frequently teach on the holiday of Shavuot. If you find an English translation or the Hebrew original of the tractate of Bikurim, chapter 3, you will see a beautiful description there of the Aliyah Regel, of the Jews marching up to Jerusalem for the Bikurim, for the holiday of Shavuot. It describes the way they're going in a big procession and they're being greeted by the citizens of Jerusalem, and the cows are decorated, the horns of the cows are decorated with flowers, and the cows are schlepping on their backs baskets of fruits. In other words, this was a really big deal. So even though it seems like it was a big schlep for something very small, apparently bringing the Bikurim to Jerusalem was considered a big deal. And many people made that trek, made that schlep from all over Israel. So if you'll read Mishnah Bikurim chapter 3, you will see the beauty of that ancient ceremony, which of course ended with the destruction of the Second Temple. We will stop here.